everyone to Fresh Fiction's Video Book Club with tonight's guest author, Joanna Davidson Politano, author of her latest book, The Elusive Truth of Lily Temple. Joanne, so great to see you tonight.
Oh, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Joanna, for our new readers and new to you readers, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you first get started writing?
Sure. So I write kind of a gothic historical fiction set in the Victorian era, slightly like mystery vibes and things like that. I got started writing just because I've loved reading since I was a kid. And I wrote kind of secret stories as a grade schooler that got passed around my classroom. And that was kind of my introduction to storytelling, and I loved it so much. So I kept going.
I love that. I mean, so even as a kid, then what kind of stories were you writing then?
Well, it really bothered me to see kids get picked on. So I wrote the picked on kids into stories and gave them superpowers, like secret superpowers. And then I made sure all the bullies didn't fare well in the stories. And when they started circulating around the classroom, nobody knew who wrote it, but people read it. And it kind of brought a lot of stuff to the surface, even for grade school. So it was kind of neat.
Well, I love that. And from the books that I've read from you, I mean, I think that's something that you've carried on where you're drawing out more emotions from the readers and you're expressing a lot more in your stories than sometimes just the initial synopsis.
I hope so. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of things that are on my heart have to do with the value of people, and that's carried through from writing superpowers into the overlooked kids to the characters I pick now.
And how do those characters come to you then?
Well, I'm not sure exactly. I think they're just I pull them together, interesting quirks and mannerisms and things like that from people that I just observe. Not even people that I'm necessarily close to, just I observe everybody and I notice and I put things together and I love conflicting character traits. So when I find them, that kind of is like the first nugget of a story.
I'm really curious about this book because there's so many different aspects to it. So digging into what was the inspiration behind the elusive truth?
Honestly, I wrote a World War II spy story years ago, to kind of get my grandfather, who was physically unable to do anything at that point, get him to help me with a project. And so I kind of loved this little spy character. So I kind of wanted to write something that had to do with private investigation. And then my main character in the other book was a thief turned into a spy. So the heroine is not a thief, but she's a storyteller with a kind of an unknown background, and people have suspicions. So it kind of evolved from that. And then the setting of the story is a real garden, and so everything about the garden pretty much is true, including the man who rented it out to produce silent films there. So that kind of the story just blossomed from that research.
I mean, because this has the historical element, it's a mystery, there's the romance, bit of a gothic romance in a way. You've got the spy
Mhm.
adventures. Like I said, there's so many different elements that are tied into this particular story. Did you find it challenging at all as you were kind of incorporating each of these, or was it all
Oh yeah.
just such a flow? It's like, oh, well, of course, this is the next element that I'm going to add in here.
Oh no. Well, I don't know. I My stories are always like a wrestling project. I never feel like they just flow easily onto the page in chronological order. I put very rough bones down and then I wrestle with them and get them into the right place like puzzle pieces to build the skeleton, and then I have to kind of stretch the muscle and the flesh over them and stuff like that. It's definitely not an easy process, but I really enjoy reading complex books and books that surprise me and books that have a lot of different elements in it. So I don't think anything less would keep my attention as a writer. So I kind of just throw everything in that I enjoy reading and see how it meshes together.
So, as you're putting together the initial skeleton, I'm assuming on this book that there's a lot of editing that then goes on. I mean, how
Yeah.
many different rounds even have to go through for the nature of this story.
Oh, more than I would like, honestly. This book in particular had so many details that I had to get right. I also have a habit of rewriting after I get the initial draft done. I completely change my plot. And so, of course, that means a ton more edits. But I go through several rounds. I have a mentor who reads for me and rewrites most of it. Not, suggests rewrites for a lot of it. And then once it goes to my publishers, it went back and forth with copy editors and with my line editor probably half a dozen times at least. And normally it's uh, once with each main editor and then once with a copy editor. But this one, they kept finding more little details that needed to be ironed out. And so, yeah, with a story this complex, everybody works really hard to make sure all the details add up.
Well, and especially with this story, because you have the mix of the real characters and
Hmm.
people who actually lived versus your fictional characters. So, how important is it that for your own fiction license versus having some of the accurate details, or is it something that can kind of be some fuzzy lines between there?
I think that's every author makes that decision because when you're writing history, there are people who really want to portray history and life as it was. And for me, I very much want to be accurate, but it's about telling a good story. And so even the heroine says in the book that, I'm not going to let the truth stand in the way of a really good story. And I try really hard not to change anything um, that really happened, but my goal is to make a story that's cohesive and makes sense and means something. So I'm also very careful when I have real people in there not to portray them in a bad light or a wrong light. So I try to just uh, take what's real and add the fiction pieces to it. So there was even a fortune-telling gypsy in this garden who really was there, and so I wrote her into the story. And the movie producer was real. Pretty much everyone else was fictional, but a lot of the events were real and things that they did and stuff like that. So I just kind of added in characters and things like that, but tried really hard to anchor it with things that were real.
Mhm. Now, you also mentioned just a minute ago of that your plot changed during the development of the story. This
It
always
did.
drives me crazy from authors. We always like to think that you've got this all figured out and you know exactly where it's going. Okay, there's edits here and there, but when you're fundamentally changing the plot, I mean, what is I mean, what would be an example of that perhaps? Or is it, I mean, such a massive overhaul, or is it just adapting the story a little bit, or it's now gone in a completely different 180 direction than you ever anticipated?
That's a good question. Honestly, I I always start out knowing the end of my story, and then I'm always wrong. So I have an ending in mind that I think is really fun and unique. But then when I get partway through, I'm always realizing it's either too guessable or not plausible, or the characters are taking their own path and it's just diverging too much. And so I kind of hold it loosely and I let it go the way it naturally needs to unfold. And a lot of times that's after I've written the whole first draft, unfortunately.
Mhm.
I've tried plotting. It doesn't really work very well for me. Um, I end up using the first few chapters, chucking the rest, and starting over. But a lot of times, what I do is I write 70% of my first draft. I send it to a few friends and I say, well, how does this end? And then everything they say gets thrown out because it's too guessable, including if it was one of the endings I'd come up with. And then I have to make sure I come up with something different. And then usually after the first draft, I have an even different ending. So it just keeps changing. But that makes it a little bit more of a surprising twist, usually for readers, which is a lot of the feedback I get is that I was shocked, which is awesome because I love to be surprised when I read. So it's also surprising for me, which keeps it fun.
And what do you do then with all these previous drafts and plot paths? I mean, are those things that you do still keep maybe in a folder of hey, this way I don't revisit this, or
Hmm.
maybe I do want it again for another book, it wouldn't make sense, or is it just completely gone forever?
Nope, I save everything. I'm very meticulous because I end up a lot of the times that I delete stuff, I end up using it in a future chapter or changing my mind and going back. So I email myself my book every night so that I always have like I can go back 3 days and see what I deleted or something. And then I also have this giant file of deletes that's probably bigger than my final document itself. And they're all there by chapter. And that's been extremely helpful because I hate for things to vanish once I've written them.
I think just being able to have that for reference and just that many different copies, I get the feeling you have lost something in the past with previous writings. It's like, okay, that is not going to happen to me again.
Yeah, over the years, I've had a computer stolen, a computer crash. So I'm more careful than I need to be probably so that I don't run up against, oh, my deadline is in a week and my book is gone because my computer crashed. I don't want to put myself in that position after working for a year.
Oh
So
my
I've learned the
gosh,
hard
that
way.
would be the other thing that I was so intrigued with this novel is, and I thought was such a nice touch too, was all your different chapter headings.
Hmm.
And so the
Yeah.
references to like Alice in Wonderland, and also, I mean, just all of the other allusions throughout the story to other writings, like with Alice, Peter Pan. I mean, how much of that was coming naturally, or was that also one of your goals to have the reference to these other tales?
Honestly, a lot of the fairy tale-esque nature of this book was inspired by reading fairy tales to my kids. We have
Mm.
read Aesop's fables and like the old original fairy tales frequently, and those they just love those. They absolutely love them. There's something magical about them, and so a lot of times a line would just kind of grab me that had to do with storytelling or something like that, and I would throw it in a file with the book it came from and I had so many of them. I was like, well, I can't really use them in the text of the book necessarily, but they kind of just flowed into what was going to happen in the chapter and things like that. And I've done chapter headings before and really enjoyed that. But I've written them in the past. These I did not write because these masters were so much better than I was.
I think it just lent such a nice whimsical touch to a lot
Yes,
of
there is
the
definitely a fairy tale theme going on in this book.
but the other thing with this, I mean, set in Edwardian England with 1903, I mean,
Mhm.
how was it doing all the research into the silent film element?
That was really interesting actually, because silent films as we think of them, Charlie Chaplin and that sort of thing, were more like in the 20s and 30s. And so 1903, my publisher wanted to keep me close to Victorian era, so Edwardian was like in the first 10 years of the 1900s. And so the very earliest films were about 3-minute clips. And so I watched a bunch of them. They were so interesting, so creative, so much more creative than I expected. They would physically manipulate the film. They would cut and splice. They would overlay things to give illusions. And the people who did these were former illusionists. And this was just basically another magic trick. So they were called magic lantern shows originally. And they did things like take off a head and set it beside them and have a conversation and then take off another head. And they showed x-rays. They showed a train going into a tunnel and coming out as a hearse. They just did all sorts of crazy things with physically manipulating the film, and those things then informed the special effects that we see today a lot of times too. So it was really fascinating to see the very origins of that.
Do you think you want to continue in the Edwardian for your other books?
I kind of enjoyed it more than I thought I would. The technology is so interesting. It's just a little bit further than the Victorian era, so we have some automobiles. And of course, we have film and things like that. So there's a little bit more to play with. Society was very different under different leadership, of course. Women's rights really had started coming to a head about 30 years before that, and even more so during the Edwardian era. The fashion is incredible. So I would definitely set more books there. I also wouldn't mind going back to the Victorian era.
I think where the Edwardian was grabbing me is because we haven't seen a lot during that time period. I mean, it's not one
Right. The
authors kind of delve into very often.
Right. The Regency is popular, and then of course Victorian era was a very long swath of time. Edwardian was really only about a decade. So, but it was such a cool, colorful, interesting time. So I would love to see more authors pick it up.
Now, I also read, okay, just like you said that your plot changed, that the theme was very important to you with this novel, and yet it changed as you were writing. How did that come about?
Sometimes we think we know what a book is about until we write it. I've kind of figured out after so many books. So I set out to kind of look at the difference between truth and fiction and people who kind of live in this I'm going to create my own reality type of mindset, and instead of dealing with what's real, kind of as a coping mechanism. And so I wanted to figure out where that line was, and it became really clear that the book was not about that as much as it was about how story can actually reveal truth, not necessarily hide it, but clarify it and prove it and make it memorable too. And so I kind of just fell in love with storytelling all over again as I figured out the theme for this novel.
It sounds like you had a lot of fun writing this book, and that's great. You always want to have the fun, but I think it's also interesting because I mean, your previous book was a lot darker. I mean,
Mhm.
the Lost Melody, it was just a darker theme overall. How was that shift from going from that book to this book?
You know, my heart really needed something lighter after that last book. The other one, it was beautiful to write. It was a great writing experience. Delving into music, and it was sort of a heart project to look at, undervalued people. That's always been on my heart, is the people who are overlooked and undervalued by the rest of the world. Um, but then after that, I really had the need for like fun, sunshine, beauty, and a lot of romantic chemistry. The romance wasn't as heavy in my previous book. So in this book, I wanted a couple who it was just really fun. And so it was wonderful to write this story. Not that it lacked depth necessarily, but just that it was more um, lacking the heaviness, I guess. And the setting was outdoors, and so it was just a complete change, which I think I needed.
So no need to like change your mood. I mean, that all came pretty naturally as soon as you kicked this one off, then, huh?
Pretty much, yeah. I was looking forward when I was in the middle of the Asylum book, which was my last book. I was looking forward to this next book, and even the plotting of it made me kind of feel like I'm taking a breath of fresh air. It was very, very fun.
Well, Joanna, I want to switch over to what we call our fresh fiction facts. And I've had some new ones added to the list since the last time we talked.
Oh, fun.
So, I mean, we continuously get stuff out there for you, right?
Yeah.
Again, these are ones that are meant to be kind of off the top of your head, not meant to stump you, even though it does sometimes happen. Um, and I'm going to start off with, of course, one of our easier standbys. Who would you most want to be stuck in an elevator with?
Hmm. Probably, I would say Frank Peretti because he's so deep and so funny at the same time. Or maybe C.S. Lewis, even though he's no longer alive. I would love to just like pick his brain for a while.
Okay. What is your favorite fairy tale?
Hmm.
Now, you've just admitted you've been reading these like crazy to the kids.
Right, right. Honestly, I really like George MacDonald's fairy tales. They're longer, but they're so beautiful and so rich.
Would you rather go back in time to meet your ancestors or travel in the future to meet your descendants?
I think back in time, there's like so many relatives that I've actually written their stories and I've been fascinated by them and never met them. And I would love to get their advice and their wisdom.
What would be the most annoying thing about having you as a roommate?
I talk to myself when I'm writing. I argue a lot of times with myself and where the book should go. And yes, my husband, it makes him giggle, but I think if somebody wasn't used to it, it might bug them.
Well, along those lines, okay, if you were kidnapped, but they return you 2 hours later because you will not stop talking about what?
Probably my kids. I enjoy my kids a lot and I homeschool them, so we're around each other all day and I could talk somebody's ear off.
Is there an author that you just have to read all of their work? Doesn't matter. You go out, new release, you get it, you go back, you read their entire library.
Christy Cambron probably is one of my favorites. I adore her books. Tessa Afshar also. Everything they write, I just eat up. I love it.
What's something that can immediately take you out of a story, be it either in a book or a movie?
It's really a pet peeve when things get kind of cheesy and corny and like the same overdone type of stuff. Then I'm kind of looking at it as like, okay, this is a story. And it takes me right out of the world.
What is your most dog-eared copy of a book? What do you go back to over and over again?
Probably Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I've read that book a lot of times.
Awesome. Okay, what's one thing that was ruined once it became popular?
Oh, that one does stump me. I'm not sure. I honestly I don't follow a lot of popular things, so I can't tell you.
Okay. How about okay, if you came with the warning label, what would it say?
Mm, a warning label. Mm, probably gets lost in thought often, repeat things many times.
Okay, this one's a little bit customized for you because of the homeschooling. What is your favorite course to do instruction on?
Well, I mean, I teach a lot of writing courses at the co-op, and that's really fun. I even like grammar. I know it's kind of like a nerdy thing, but I get really excited teaching fiction. Like even my little kids, they know how to write stories.
And there is no ding about getting excited about grammar. I have actual grammar, but I mean the each Leave is classic, Confessions of a Comma Queen. My
Oh,
Tech Dots
yes.
group at work, because we'll get in and start debating about AP style versus MLS handbook. I mean, it's like, really? Yeah, it's, yeah, we go back and forth on that stuff a lot.
That's pretty amazing.
So,
My
with that,
kids
what
like
is
the
your
East,
opinion on
East,
the
and These.
Oxford comma? Yay or nay?
What was that?
With that, what is your opinion on the Oxford comma then? Is that a yay
Oh,
or a nay?
always. Always use the Oxford comma.
What is the thing on your to do list that you keep moving out?
Plan next year's curriculum. That one keeps getting shifted out and yeah.
Okay, you will hit a timeline eventually on that one.
Yes. I will probably have to come up with something this summer, but yeah, that'll happen.
Okay, what is the clothing or accessory that everyone else hates, but you secretly love and will never get rid of?
Well, I would say long dresses. Um, kind of like the old style because they're so comfortable. They're so comfortable and I will wear them all day long teaching my kids. It's either that or sweatpants. So,
There's a lot to be said for comfort, right?
yep.
I mean, golly. Okay, what is the best book that you've read recently?
Hmm. Let's see. I read The Wishing Game. That was a pretty good book. And I cannot remember who wrote it. but that was really wonderful.
Right. The Mount Rushmore of authors. Which 4 authors belong on it? They could be your favorite
Ooh,
or the most influential.
I would say Roald Dahl for children's literature. He's pretty amazing. Probably C.S. Lewis for deep thoughts. Gosh, this is a hard one. Only 4? Hmm. I'm drawing a blank here. I don't know. I think Melanie Dobson. She's an author I don't hear a lot, but her books are so fantastic. And I don't know. Maybe Lynn Austin. Her research is incredible.
I like the spread across these. Sir,
A lot of variety.
good choice. And Joanna, of course, our readers always want to know what can they look forward to you next?
So I'm about to
What are you
turn in
working
my
on?
next book to my publisher, and it is a like Clockworks type book. So we've got a little bit of a steampunk thing going on. I wouldn't call it a
Really?
steampunk genre specifically, but steampunk elements. There's an industrialist and a giant house of his inventions, and the house is really kooky itself. And that should be coming out in the spring of next year.
Awesome. And with that, where is the best place for our readers and listeners to keep in touch with you, find out any new thoughts, and of course, look for the announcements for that next book?
I do have a newsletter that you can sign up for on my website, which is jdpstories.com. I have a Facebook and Instagram author page. And then I also have a reader focused Facebook group called Once Upon a Story, where it's more of like a hair down book chit chat type of thing. And I often share my news there first.
Awesome. Well, Joanna, thanks again for joining Fresh Fiction today, but stick around for some additional questions with some of our readers.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.